Today's video is brought to you by Ridge, minimalist without being limiting. I'll tell you more about them in a little bit. Now you come to me and you say, Don Corleone, give me justice. But you don't ask with respect. You don't offer friendship. You don't even think to call me Godfather. Instead, you come into my house on the day my daughter is to be married, and you ask me to do murder for money. Such are the words of Don Vito Corleone, Marlon Brando's iconic character in Mario Puzo's novel The Godfather and in the Francis Ford Coppola films of the same name. Written as an amalgamation of real-life figures within the New York Mafia, Vito Corleone represented the head of the fictional crime family and a powerful player within the shadowy underbelly of the American 1940s and 50s. But although a viewer might not have known it just by watching the Godfather movies, even the austere, elderly Vito Corleone would have represented a new breed within the Italian Mafia, had he been a real person, of course. A crime family like Corleone's was just part of a broader crime syndicate in New York, one that only took its modern shape in the 1930s after a very real series of events turned the Mafia's traditions and customs on its head. In the Castellammarese War of 1930 and 1931, two Sicilian mob bosses would wage war across New York City in a violent struggle for dominance. The one that emerged victorious would become the capo di tutti I capi, the boss of all bosses, before becoming victim to the next generation of mobsters arising from the ashes that the boss of all bosses had left in his wake. On January 16, 1919, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed into law. The item it regarded? Alcohol, and with a policy of complete and total prohibition of the sale of it for human consumption. Although it was known in its time as the Noble Experiment, Prohibition's attempt to outlaw the drink was in reality a very simple fix to a series of very complex problems, and we apologize if this is a mortal shock to any of our listeners, but as it turns out, simply banning alcohol doesn't make people stop wanting to drink it. What it does do is create a black market, and the American black market of this time was more than ready to add another trade to its portfolio. In the early 1920s, the Sicilian Mafia had gained a controlling share of the market on illegal business in many parts of the United States. In New York, for example, the group's influence had only continued to swell, and a wave of immigration from Sicily, brought on by the rise of Benito Mussolini and his fascist party in Italy, swelled the Mafia's ranks with new recruits. This was perfectly timed to coincide with growing demand in the illegal alcohol market, and the Mafia's ranks of foot soldiers stepped right in to meet the public's needs where legitimate business fell away. With its ubiquitous role in American society both before and since, alcohol sales and bootlegging was a much bigger business than prostitution, gambling, protection, or any of the other traditional services that the Mafia provided, and the factions that made the most of their new situation were able to far eclipse the growth of their competitors. With dominant factions and new enlistments came a level of organization that the American underground hadn't seen before. Now the Mafia couldn't just consist of one halfway decent gangster and a half dozen thugs per operation. They needed lawyers, they needed recruiters, they needed men to transport and protect their product. They needed not just bosses, but underbosses and leaders on the street who could be trusted to make their own decisions with a valuable enterprise. The groups that were able to organize then gained another competitive advantage and could force their competitors to join or waste away on the small sliver of profit that they could access by themselves. So let me interrupt today's video to tell you about a product that is built for life, and it's new, and it's from Ridge, a brand that you might recognize for their signature wallets. But today we're talking about something different, and that would be the Ridge beveled ring set. I'm wearing one right here. I've got another one right here. Look, these rings are made with premium materials like carbon fiber, tungsten carbide, and titanium. And they're designed with an outer beveled edge for on-hand comfort, and also this inner convex shape for this sort of comfortable, no-pinch fit. And the best part, each ring comes with a dual band silicone ring for when you just want to be a little bit more comfortable or casual. You just slip that in and you just slip that on and you're good to go. But that's not all. The Ridge uses the same premium materials and designs from their signature wallets. You can see here, I've got on the titanium ring, and this matches up with the titanium wallet. Beautiful. So if you want a ring that can keep up with your active lifestyle, be sure to check out the Ridge beveled ring set or Ridge wallets at ridge.com/warographics, or just click the link in the description below and enter the promo code warographics for a 10% discount. And remember, each ring comes with lost and resizing protection, so you are covered for life. Again, ridge.com/warographics. Thank you, Ridge, for the sponsorship, and now back to today's video. During the Prohibition era, the Italian Mafia in the United States was largely under control of one man, Joe the Boss. Born Giuseppe Masseria, his enterprise consisted mostly of Sicilians like himself, with other recruits from the Calabria and Campania regions of Italy, the toe of the Italian boot, and, if we can extend the metaphor, the lower ankle part. With the help of a wide cast of characters, including Charles Lucky Luciano, pay attention to that name, he'll be important later, Masseria arose to the top of New York's crime scene. However, Joe the Boss was not universally loved within the crime world, nor was he a particularly effective crime boss or a particularly pleasant person to get along with. He also didn't totally represent Sicily's own will in the United States, and with a less than iron grip on his position, senior gangsters within Sicily began to eye Joe the Boss's mob structure in New York with a somewhat hungrier gaze. The first to make a move was Don Vito Ferro, a Sicilian with a base of operations in the town of Castellammarese del Golfo on the part of Sicily's coast that lies closest to the Atlantic. But Don Ferro didn't come to America himself to challenge Joe the Boss Masseria. Instead, he sent a young, trusted associate, a Sicilian named Salvador Maranzano, to intervene on his behalf. Maranzano was everything Masseria wasn't, an authoritative presence in the underworld, a student of historical leaders like Julius Caesar, and a man who had carefully positioned himself inside the American legitimate and illegitimate business sectors at once, using a legitimate real estate company as a front for his bootlegging and other illegal acts. Maranzano leveraged his own network of underbosses and enforcers who had often run up against Joe the Boss's operation in their time sharing the bootlegging market. In these years, it wasn't uncommon for various mafia factions to go to war in the streets, hijacking each other's alcohol shipments and killing off each other's muscle. While this was a short-term gain for whichever gangster was stealing the other's product, it was a distraction from the broader goal of collective enrichment, and frankly, it was bad for business. Maranzano was Don Ferro's choice to take over the market and funnel profits in a single direction. By 1930, the hostilities between Masseria's entrenched leadership and Maranzano's faction began to boil over. Now, we're going to be tossing out both of these names and a bunch of other ones, so to avoid confusion, we'll refer to Masseria, the more established leader within New York, as Joe the Boss. So early in 1930, tensions between both sides began to boil over, with more and more frequent violence in the streets. Frustrated by the sense that his authority within the underground was diminishing, Joe the Boss had begun to lash outward, ordering the death of a Detroit mobster who had humiliated him. But it wasn't Joe the Boss's first high-profile assassination order that year, but his second that would get him into hot water. In late February, he ordered the killing of Gaetano Reyna, head of his own crime family in the Bronx and East Harlem. Reyna was a powerful player in the city. For example, he leveraged a total monopoly on the sale and distribution of ice boxes in the Bronx, which may be the most 1930s mafia sentence that we've said so far. Reyna had been an ally of Joe the Boss for years, but after losing faith in his leadership, Reyna went over to Maranzano's side. In return for his betrayal, Joe the Boss had him killed, which ended up being an excellent indicator to the Reyna crime family that they were right to leave Joe the Boss behind. This rose tensions between Joe the Boss and Maranzano to boiling point, and when Joe the Boss took out his frustrations on another ally of the Maranzano syndicate, Maranzano struck back. In August of 1930, the Castellammarese faction under Maranzano executed one of Joe the Boss's key enforcers. 2 weeks later, the Reyna family killed the man who had taken over Gaetano Reyna's icebox monopoly, who was also installed by Joe the Boss. These two killings brought the Castellammarese gangsters and the Reyna family together for good, and never one to leave a killing unanswered, Joe the Boss ordered the death of an ally of Maranzano, this time a prominent Sicilian from Chicago. Both sides had escalated to a point of no return. But if you recall the dichotomy between the brash, somewhat inefficient leadership of Joe the Boss and the smooth, cunning, and disciplined organization of Maranzano, it shouldn't be a shock that one began playing checkers, while the other began a game of 8-dimensional chess. Maranzano took control of the situation in short order with the murders of a family leader, Alfred Mineo, and a deputy of Joe the Boss named Steve Ferrigno. Alfred Mineo's replacement brought his crime family over to Maranzano's authority, and so did a number of high-level members of Joe the Boss's outfit who could see where the tide was turning. As winter dragged on into 1931, another lieutenant of Joe the Boss was gunned down, and two of his highest-ranking supporters, Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese, began back-channeling communications with Maranzano. Luciano and Genovese weren't necessarily interested in supporting Maranzano indefinitely, but both understood that an end to the war was more important than the continued survival of Joe the Boss. They reached a deal with Maranzano. Lucky Luciano would arrange for Joe the Boss to be killed, and in return, Maranzano would bring the violence to a close. The hit took place on April 15, 1931 during a card game between Joe the Boss, Lucky Luciano, and a few others at a restaurant in Coney Island. At a predetermined time, Luciano stepped away to use the restroom, and a team led by Vito Genovese gunned down Joe the Boss from behind. Nobody would be convicted for the murder, and with Joe the Boss's death, the Castellammarese War came to an end. So that should be the end of our story, right? Maranzano assumes control of the mafia across New York, Joe the Boss's loyalists are made an offer they can't refuse, and everybody gets rich on American alcoholism's dime. Right? Well, no, not really, and for two key reasons. The first reason was a choice by Maranzano himself to grant control of each of the New York boroughs to a different crime family within the mafia. These became known as the Five Families, the structure that still dictates the New York mafia to this day. Lucky Luciano's family, now the modern-day Genovese crime family, the Profesi family, now the Colombo family, the Gaglianos, now the Luccheses, the Maranzanos, now the Bonanos, and the Scalizzi family, now the Gambino family. Each family would be run by a crime boss, supported by an underboss, a direct subordinate, and a consigliere, an advisor. The underboss would oversee capos, or captains, who would run street crews of full-blooded Italian-American soldiers assisted by so-called associates from any background. This was an intentional choice by Maranzano, both to make the mafia more survivable in the long run and to stratify control across New York, along with a number of other crime families that he chose to run other cities and regions in America. The second reason this all didn't pan out as planned was also because of Maranzano, but not intentionally. The war between Maranzano and Joe the Boss had been between two of the mafia's older generation, known as Moustache Pete's, old-world businessmen from Sicily, distinguished by their long moustaches and their strong preference not to do business with anyone except other Italians. Maranzano and Joe the Boss might have had their differences on how the mafia should be run, but they were in agreement about what it was, what the core essence of their syndicate should be. This was in stark contrast to the so-called Young Turks, the generation of mobsters who had been born or raised in the United States. These mobsters were far more forward-thinking, diverse in their own backgrounds, and willing to work with a diverse array of partners rather than treating Irish or Jewish or other ethnic mafias as enemies by default. Unlike Maranzano, Lucky Luciano was very much a Young Turk, and this critical difference is why it's been so important to follow his side of the story. From Luciano's perspective, the entire Castellammarese War had been a waste of time and a waste of money, a distraction from the broader objective to run America's black market. Luciano and the Young Turks had been alright with the removal of Joe the Boss, but that was because Joe the Boss had been bad for business, and Maranzano, despite being a far better strategist, was bad for business in all the same ways. As Lucky Luciano and the other new generation leaders saw it, orthodoxy and traditionalism stood in the way of profit rather than enhancing it, as Maranzano and Joe the Boss believed. This became a problem when Maranzano instituted his second change to the mafia's structure, declaring himself the capo di tutti I capi, the boss of all bosses. As Maranzano saw it, his hostile takeover of the New York mafia meant that its business ran through him, no matter which regions or industries were controlled by each family. He declared himself boss of all bosses at a meeting between the crime families in upstate New York, a declaration which Lucky Luciano was not interested in supporting. For all Luciano cared, Maranzano had just marked himself as the same sort of greedy overlord as Joe the Boss, but with an even bigger appetite for personal enrichment. The other families agreed and stood aside to let Luciano do what he did best. Within a few months, Luciano had arranged for Maranzano to be killed By this time, the two each understood the threat posed by the other, and Luciano was determined to move against Maranzano before Maranzano could move against him. And not only that, but Maranzano had gotten into some potential tax trouble with the federal government, a ticking time bomb that could have brought much of the mafia down if it had shaken out the wrong way. On September 10th, 1931, Salvatore Maranzano was shot and stabbed to death in Manhattan by a team recruited from the Jewish Mafia, with his childhood friends, the now famous mobster Bugsy Siegel, being one of the men involved with the hit. Although no new boss of all bosses stood up in his place, Lucky Luciano essentially became a de facto leader of the transition into the five-family structure. Although it's not confirmed, the night of the Sicilian Vespers was a rumored purge of other old-world moustache Petes within the Mafia, allegedly orchestrated by Luciano. There's only minimal evidence that any purge took place, but Luciano is known to have participated in at least a low-level purge of Maranzano's core associates. In their place rose the Commission, a new superstructure for mafia organization that Lucky Luciano championed as a way to increase both profits and willful cooperation with the mafia's broader goals. The five-family structure Maranzano had proposed remained in effect, but with a far less regimented structure that was designed to model the mafia after a major corporation rather than a small-time crime syndicate. While status as an Italian-American remained central to a person's ability to become a part of the Italian mafia family itself, the generation of the Young Turks had no issue partnering with other organizations as long as they could pull their weight. And at the top, the Commission would replace a structure of singular leadership with rule by committee. No longer could any mobster declare themselves boss of all bosses. Anyone who even had a remote claim to that title would no doubt be part of the Commission, and if anyone upstart were to try and overthrow the existing system, the Commission would be there to beat them down. After all, in the world of the Young Turks, petty things like ideology, ethnicity, and a vision for the future all came second to profit. Any ideology guiding mythos or secondary principle of business was there to be subservient to profit, and not the other way around. The future of the Mafia would thus lie with the Commission, with the five families of New York, the families in charge of the rest of America's cities, and any other sophisticated criminal outfit who could prove they deserved to be in on the action. In the wake of the Castellammarese War, the ultimate victor was not Joe the Boss or Salvatore Maranzano or the Sicilian Dons who had, to a degree, been pulling the strings in the American Mafia during and before the conflict. In fact, the victor wasn't even Lucky Luciano, despite his status as architect of the old order's downfall. Instead, it was the Mafia itself that won the war, an Italian-American crime syndicate run by and for the Italian-American criminals and those they chose to include in the profits. Far more than a bitter power struggle, the Castellammarese War was the fall of an old order and the rise of the more effective, more focused, and above all else, more profitable Mafia that still exists today.